Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Okay, welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. So, earlier this week, David Eby made a statement about putting a pause on a British Columbia bill that would ensure young people being safe online. A lot of this has to do with things like child pornography, child trafficking, sex worker trafficking, that sort of thing. And along with that pause, that he also made a statement with the folks from Meta, TikTok, and what was formerly known as Twitter X. They're talking about making sure that wrongdoers get reported and stopped as quickly as possible on the internet, at the speed of information, shall we say. Along with it, there is also a federal bill that was introduced, Bill C-68, and it is called the Online Harms Act, and it would amend a criminal code and the Human Rights Act and an act respecting the mandatory reporting of an internet child pornography by persons who provide an internet service, and to make consequences related to the amendments to other acts. There is a long list of things here, and we'll put that up on our blog site, what this bill actually might look like. Along with that, let's have a little rant about plastics, and something to think about every day when you go buy that bottled water or that bottled drink from the grocery store. You might want to reconsider buying those drinks and finding yourself a reusable drink bottle. And along with that, reconsider what it is that you're actually drinking, because there's a bunch of myths around the bottled water industry. Most of these guys, if you look at the source for the water, the source is whatever city tap water they can manage to grab a hold of. It's not exactly what you think it is. And maybe you might want to consider with that putting a charcoal filter on your own tap water, and just filter it so it tastes a little better to you. But the fact of it is, and this is a statistic that I heard today, that picture a kitchen garbage bag being dumped into the ocean full of plastic bottles. Now picture that happening once every 60 seconds. And if the microplastic thing doesn't actually filter into you, that human beings are actually consuming it, that the average human being consumes in microplastics approximately the weight of one credit card every week. I mean, to me, that's, well, I use a reusable drink bottle. I also just drink tap water. To make it taste better, I boil it sometimes. And then let it cool off, and there we have it. I don't drink sodas or soft drinks that are bought from the grocery store. Maybe on occasion I'll have a fountain drink if I'm in a restaurant, but that's the extent of that. Something to consider, something to reconsider in your own life. Okay, so we're also going to hear about that topic as there was some discussion on it in Ottawa about the effects of that environment and the plastic bottle industry, the plastics industry in general. And here we go. We'll just read a bit of the description. Representatives from one of the First Nations and various other groups hold a news conference in Ottawa, raising the concern about environmental harms caused by the plastics industry in Canada. The same First Nation called on Ontario government to shut down a chemical plant in Sarnia after high levels of cancer-causing chemical benzenes were detected in the Ontario First Nations and several other communities. Several other community members fell ill and were hospitalized. Speaking with reporters are Janelle Nahmabin, the elected councillor of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Dr. Sehjal Sabaa Khan, the climate director. Let's try that again. Dr. Sehjal Bhargava, Canada Association of Physicians for the Environment, Melissa Gorrie, Law Reform Manager of Ecojustice, Sabaa Khan, Climate Director and Director of Quebec and Atlantic Canada, David Suzuki Foundation, and Karen Wirsig, Senior Program Manager for Plastics and Environmental Defense. The news conference comes as Canada hosted a fourth UN session of Intergovernment Negotiation Committee. Delegates from around the world will be meeting in the nation's capital from April 23rd to April 29th to develop an international legally binding agreement on plastic pollution by the end of 2024. Hopefully that whatever the consequences is actually aimed at the plastics industry and cannot be filtered back down again to the simple folk, as we have seen with carbon pricing, that it would seem that the average working class person is going to bear the brunt of the carbon pricing because the corporations are allowed to filter it down to the consumer. So why don't we start off with the environmental group as they discuss the harms of plastic products.
Good morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who have inhabited and cared for these lands since time immemorial. We express our deepest gratitude and respect to them. The fourth session of the INC is well underway now. It has been encouraging to see member states' seriousness to rapidly get to the substantive matters at hand. The challenge over the next days will be to shorten the lengthy document while ensuring that its most critical and ambitious elements are not watered down or eliminated as we move to the last round of negotiations at the end of the year. In this regard, it was a positive sign to hear host country Canada's Minister of Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, affirm at the very outset that the treaty must restrain plastic production in order for it to be effective. Hopefully, we can build consensus on this coming out of INC4. Of course, in parallel to production limits, the instrument's success will also intrinsically depend on how it governs chemicals and petrochemical extraction. Studies on chemicals and plastics have shown us, time and time again, that restrictions of chemicals of concern are fundamental to ensuring the safety of human health, particularly of Indigenous communities, waste pickers, children, and other vulnerable groups who are most heavily impacted by plastic pollution. We will hear today directly from elected councillor Janelle Nahmabin on the long-standing struggle and resistance of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation against the toxic impacts of the petrochemical production cluster in this very province. We are hopeful that the strong representation and advocacy at INC4 on the damaging and even lethal public health effects of thousands of chemicals used in plastics will provide the necessary momentum for member states to make progress on this element of the Plastics Treaty. At the same time, the interconnected fossil fuel, petrochemical, and plastics industries continue distracting progress, as they have done throughout these negotiations. They maintain a singular focus on narrow, end-of-life solutions, when in fact our center of attention must really be at the source of the problem. This treaty is not only about recycling and waste. As we heard from the Global Waste Pickers Alliance earlier this week, the Global Plastics Treaty is a matter of life. Communities and workers all across the globe want and deserve better options. Options that preserve our right to health, our right to a healthy environment, our right to decent work. Through a strong global plastics treaty, states can give industry the right signals on the primacy of public health over profit. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Karen Wirsig. I am Senior Program Manager for Plastics at Environmental Defense. Plastic pollution is a global crisis that intensifies every day that we let plastic production and use go unchecked. Aamjiwnaang and other communities on the front line of plastic pollution cannot afford business as usual, and yet we are seeing business interests far too present on the negotiating floor, while First Nations have no official voice. It has taken until today for delegates to begin discussing in detail the control measures we need to see around the world to stop plastic pollution and protect our health and frontline communities from devastation. These measures include an immediate cap on plastic production and a timeline to reduce production over time, requirements for transparency on just what chemicals are being put into plastics, elimination of toxic additives, including bisphenols, phthalates, and PFAS, and elimination of harmful single-use products. We will be watching the countries that say they want ambition, including Canada. We expect them to champion strong measures and find a way to get beyond industry-friendly delay tactics from a small group of like-minded countries and make progress on these essential elements of a global plastics treaty. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Sehjal Bhargava, and I'm a resident physician in public health and preventive medicine and family medicine here in Ottawa. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment to amplify the call for urgent and ambitious global plastics treaty and to call on the Canadian government to take immediate action on plastic pollution for our planet and our health. Plastic production threatens human health at every stage of life, from cradle to grave. Plastics are a toxic exposure problem. The news of plastic being found on the most remote regions of Earth now has parallel news from health. Microplastics are being found in our blood, lungs, placental tissue, and even crossing the blood-brain barrier. Further, exposure to plastics and its toxic components are inequitable and disproportionately impact Indigenous and racialized communities, such as what is being currently seen in the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, women identifying persons, children, and workers. In my family medicine practice, my patients include pregnant people and children of all ages. These children are growing up with unprecedented exposure to plastic and its toxic byproducts, introducing risk factors and impacting health through the lifespan in ways that we don't currently understand. But the evidence we do have is grim. Exposure to the additives in plastic are already linked with central nervous system dysfunction, endocrine disruption, immune suppression, and systemic inflammation. Micro and nanoplastics have even been found as components in samples of the plaques found in blood vessels that are linked to devastating events like heart attacks and stroke. With something as pervasive as plastics, it is up to decision makers to do the right thing for health and protect people from the consequences of continued exposure to plastic-related pollution. Canada must make health and environmental justice a key focus in the global plastic treaty and in federal policy. Action today could save billions of dollars in healthcare-associated costs and direct neurodevelopmental and reproductive disorders, obesity, asthma, and cancers in present and future generations. We need an ambitious global treaty, but there's also no need to wait. The Canadian government must act now. Recent commitments, such as the new registry to track plastic production, are commendable, but far more is necessary. This is the moment to show ambition and leadership. We call on the federal government to make concrete commitments to reduce plastic production, utilize nature-based solution and Indigenous knowledge with consent, eliminate toxic additives, address environmental injustice in our communities, and protect the health of people in Canada. Thank you.
Buju ani kinawea, maskanwed kwen indijna kazmakwa and doda Aamjiwnaang and donjaba nishna bekwe and dao. My name is Janelle Nahmabin. I'm from Aamjiwnaang First Nation. We're on the outskirts of Sarnia, Ontario, also known as Chemical Valley. This is where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals come from. My small First Nation community is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities. As a result, Aamjiwnaang's inherent rights, human rights, and nature rights have been the sacrifice zone for industry for over 100 years. Last week, my community went into lockdown due to dangerously high benzene levels, still in lockdown. Children sick, our childcare and school closed, our administration closed, people stayed indoors and fear even the air that they're breathing inside is poisonous. Why? Because we're a stone throw away from Ineo-Styrolutions, which uses benzene to produce styrene for polystyrene operations, one of the most commonly used plastics. Our concern isn't only that one facility. We have aged equipment that has collapsed. That's Imperial Oil's aged equipment, a Suncor tank exploding, which caused a community evacuation, and numerous hospital visits from children. Microplastics are also found in our river from Nova Chemicals. What I'm sharing with you is nothing new. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, our Human Health and Toxics, visited my community when he did a tour of Canada. His report was issued in 2022, and it says the following. The situation of Aamjiwnaang First Nation in Sarnia is profoundly unsettling. Deeply connected with their land, the residents on the reserve have been invaded by industry as far back as the 1940s, but it's been longer than that. They are now almost entirely surrounded by over 60 industrial facilities whose presence creates physiological and mental stress among community members because of the risk of impending explosions or other disasters, and because of chronic exposure to unquestionably poisonous substances. Sarnia, one of the most polluted places in Canada, has been dubbed Chemical Valley. Various interlocutors acknowledge that existing regulations do not protect the health of Aamjiwnaang. Improvements can be made in terms of investigating the health impacts, conducting proper monitoring, and enforcing existing standards. Risk assessments do not fully take into account the cumulative health impacts. The environmental injustice to which Aamjiwnaang is subject to is an ongoing tragedy. The legacy of a land use planning that would never be allowed today. It continues, but I'll leave it at that. With UNDRIP being adopted, it needs to be included in the plastic treaty because the people impacted by plastic pollution from extraction through pipelines to refineries to microplastics are the ones that most impacted, mostly Indigenous people around the world. It's worth mentioning that the environment I live in is a result of inadequate regulations, monitoring, and enforcement. Plastic pollution has been able to increase in my nation due to lack of regulations that would protect our rights and our health from plastic pollution. We need stricter regulations that eliminate chemicals and polymers of concern with deadlines for outcomes that are enforced. And not in 100 years like the people of Aamjiwnaang have had to go through and that we continue to go through. Industry self-reporting is not working. We need regulations that guarantee Aamjiwnaang and Indigenous peoples around the world a safe and healthy environment. We do not need any new plastic facilities. What we need is a binding cap on plastic production moving forward. Chimiigwech.
Morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Gorrie, and I'm a law reform manager with Ecojustice Canada. Last week, as many of us were preparing to travel to unceded and stolen Anishinaabe-Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa, for these plastic treaty negotiations, the community warning of high levels of benzene in the air, as Janelle has just mentioned. We know that this Inyo styrene plant has repeatedly released benzene into the air at levels that exceed what is acceptable. And the Ontario government has failed over many years to adequately hold the company accountable and to enforce regulations. What is happening in Janelle's community demonstrates why the plastic treaty needs to center human health, Indigenous rights, the right to a healthy environment, as well as address the environmental racism and environmental injustice that is at the heart of the plastic pollution crisis. What is happening in Aamjiwnaang is an environmental emergency, and the long history of environmental racism and colonialism that the community has experienced requires immediate action from the federal government, especially as it hosts these pivotal international negotiations to end plastic pollution. That's why this morning, just now, a few minutes ago, a letter signed in solidarity with Aamjiwnaang First Nation by more than 100 organizations from around the world was sent to Minister of Environment and Climate Change Stephen Guilbeault and other members of the federal government and other levels of government. As a global collective of many Indigenous peoples, frontline communities, environmental activists, health groups, and civil society members, we are calling on the federal government to take immediate steps to ensure the Inyo styrolution plant in Sarnia is closed until such time that Aamjiwnaang First Nation is satisfied, not the government satisfied, the First Nation is satisfied that Inyo styrolution is able and willing to meet the health-based air quality standards and the community demands. Minister Guilbeault has an obligation under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as Janelle had mentioned, as well as the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, to address this urgent situation and these environmental injustices. As host to this plastic treaty negotiations, we expect the federal government to take immediate steps to demonstrate leadership on the global stage. We need action, not just words. They must take these actions to protect frontline communities in line with their commitments to advance an ambitious global treaty that tackles the full life cycle of pollution, including production at the source. Failure to act puts at risk Canadians' reputation and credibility, both domestically and internationally, as a leader to address the plastic pollution crisis. Canada must act with integrity and walk the talk. Set an example at the global stage by taking action to address this environmental emergency and the environmental racism that Aamjiwnaang First Nation has experienced from benzene pollution for far, far too long. Thank you. I think we're now open to questions.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. For the last several months, the United States and Japan worked hand in hand on a UN Security Council resolution aimed at strengthening and upholding the global non-proliferation regime, including in outer space. This is a simple matter of maintaining international peace and security, the core responsibility of the Security Council. Unfortunately, today, Russia abandoned that responsibility by vetoing a straightforward resolution, a resolution that wasn't just ours, but belonged to all 65 co-sponsors. China abstained on it, preferring to play the junior partner to Russia than uphold the non-proliferation regime. This resolution would have reaffirmed the shared goal of preventing an arms race in outer space and urged exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes. It would have reaffirmed the obligations of all states, parties, not to place any objects carrying nuclear weapons or other WMD in orbit around Earth, in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. A treaty that 115 countries have joined, including Russia and China. It would have called on member states not to even develop nuclear weapons for this purpose. And it would have helped prevent the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear detonation in space, which could destroy satellites that are vital to communications, agriculture, sustainable development, national security, and more. Needless to say, we are incredibly disappointed by the result of today's vote, but we remain undeterred. The United States and Japan will continue to model transparency, accountability, and cooperation. We will continue to show up to the negotiating table in good faith and encourage bilateral arms control discussions with Russia and China right now without preconditions. And we will continue to work with partners like those 65 countries that co-sponsored today's resolution to ensure countries cannot deploy nuclear weapons in outer space. Today's vote marks a real missed opportunity to rebuild much-needed trust in existing arms control obligations. Now begins the work of righting that wrong. Thank you. Take any questions? Sure.
So obviously you're concerned about an arms race in space, and the way through the Security Council is blocked. So what's next steps to prevent that, an arms race?
Well, we continue to work every day in Geneva, and I'm speaking now in my national capacity here. We continue to work every day in Geneva to try to do what we can to prevent the deployment of weapons in outer space. China and Russia will talk to you about this Paros Treaty, the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. There is no consensus in Geneva on that, and one of the reasons is because their treaty does not deal with terrestrial-based weapons. And frankly, the second issue is it's not verifiable, and experts will tell you it is not verifiable. However, we will continue. We've been looking to try to improve cooperation through confidence-building measures in space. So we'll continue, as Ambassador Thomas Greenfield said in the room, we'll continue to work on these issues, and we're prepared to work with Russia and China bilaterally on arms control. Anything else? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is in general regarding this issue in terms of how do you see the role of Iran and North Korea? How do you see the role of Iran and North Korea in terms of not abiding by almost anything regarding outer space and nuclear weapons?
Well, obviously we have been concerned about Iran's nuclear program and activities for quite some time. And of course, as you know, DPRK, the DPRK file is an important file here, and we haven't been able to make progress on that file because of Russia and China. Basically two countries that were supportive, that joined a council consensus on dealing with the DPRK's nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile programs. And somehow they now have left that consensus, and you'll have to ask them why. But it is very concerning overall about the activities of Iran in the nuclear arena, as well as the DPRK.
Yeah. All right. Good afternoon. In a short while, we will be joined by our friend Carl Scow, the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of the World Food Program. He is here to brief you on his recent visit to Haiti and answer any other questions you may have. Also on Haiti, I can tell you that we welcome the official installation of the Transitional Presidential Council that took place in Port-au-Prince today. We call on the new authorities and all stakeholders to expedite the full implementation of the transitional governance arrangements. We've taken note of Ariel Henry's letter dated yesterday in which he is resigning as Prime Minister, as well as the publication in the official Gazette announcing that Finance Minister Michel Patrick Boisvert is now the interim Prime Minister. The Secretary General reiterates his call for the swift deployment of the multinational security support mission to Haiti to support the Haitian National Police in addressing the dire security situation. The Secretary General appeals to all member states to ensure the multinational security support mission receives the financial and logistical support it needs to succeed. This morning, Geir Pedersen, the Secretary General Special Envoy for Syria, briefed Security Council members while addressing other vital issues. Mr. Pedersen underscored that renewing the Constitutional Committee is essential, and he remains open to any alternative venues to Geneva that attracts the consensus of both the Syrian parties and the host. Meanwhile, Mr. Pedersen continues to appeal for sessions to resume in Geneva as a bridging option. For his part, Ramesh Rajasingham, the Director of Operations at OCHA, the Director of Coordination Division at OCHA, told Council members that humanitarians' needs in Syria are already at record level. He added that the cross-border operations from Turkey continues to enable vital aid to enter northwest Syria, adding that we are currently engaging with the government of Syria for the use of the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings beyond May 13th, which would make a big difference in the lives of so many people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And just to flag that later today at 3 p.m., the High Commissioner for Human Rights, our friend Mr. Volker Turk, will brief the General Assembly on the implementation of the GA resolution that establishes the independent institution on missing persons in Syria. The mandate of the institution is to clarify the fate and whereabouts of all missing persons in Syria, and in relation to that, to support all victims, including survivors and family members. The High Commissioner's statement will be available to you under embargo about an hour before his briefing gets underway. Moving to Gaza, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, our colleagues at OCHA, and our humanitarian partners are working on healthcare in Gaza, report that as of yesterday, only 54% of patients requiring medical evacuation had their requests approved by Israeli authorities. That's fewer than 5,300 patients out of the more than 9,800 in total that need evacuation for medical reasons. Meanwhile, the overwhelming number of conflict-related injuries in Gaza has strained evacuation resources, with injuries being prioritized over chronic illness such as kidney failure and heart disease. Humanitarian partners report that in some cases, children in urgent need of kidney dialysis have died while awaiting evacuation permission. Our colleagues from UNRWA warn that the risk of disease is spreading high in Gaza, with alarming rates of diarrhea and hepatitis. And in Rafah, there are about 1.5 million people are displaced or living. Trash is building up between makeshift shelters, heightening the sanitation and hygiene crisis. UNRWA says that access to fresh water is also very limited, posing a growing threat to public health, particularly as temperatures in Gaza are starting to rise. Sigrid Kaag, our senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza, briefed the council yesterday evening on the situation in Gaza and said that a paradigm shift is needed to continue to meet the immense needs of the civilian population in a safe and in a secure manner. The paradigm shift, she said, requires a further scale-up of the quality and quantity of assistance and distribution, irreversible steps to enable safe, secure, and unhindered aid delivery in Gaza, and planning and timely preparations for early recovery and reconstructions. She told the council that operationalizing the UN 2720 mechanism for Gaza will start in the coming days. The mechanism, she said, will initially be applicable to the Cyprus and Jordan routes respectively. Technical consultations are being taken for Egypt, and you saw her also yesterday at the stakeout. Moving to the African continent, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, more than 20 years after their arrival in the country, the peacekeepers from Pakistan are now preparing to leave the country. The contingent constituted the bulk of peacekeepers deployed in the South Kivu province. Their departure is part of the UN peacekeeping mission's disengagement plan from the country, initiated at the beginning of this year. Since 2003, when they were first deployed, more than 100,000 peacekeepers from Pakistan have served in South Kivu, including 31 Pakistani soldiers who died in the line of duty in the service of the United Nations and the people of the Congo. Today, our colleagues held a ceremony to recognize their important contribution to peace and security. As we mentioned, according to the disengagement plan, in parallel with the UN withdrawal of in parallel with the withdrawal of UN troops, the Congolese government will increase its presence in the area the mission is vacating at the government's request. And staying in the region and going to Sudan, in a joint statement released today, the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Msuya, and the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflicts, Pramila Patten, appealed for more international engagement to combat sexual violence against women and girls in Sudan. Their appeal comes as allegations of rape, forced marriage, sexual slavery, and the trafficking of women and girls continue to be recorded, especially in Khartoum, as well as Darfur and Kordofan. And as the Security Council will resume its meeting tomorrow afternoon on conflict-related sexual violence, Ms. Msuya and Ms. Patton are urging members to send an unequivocal message, which is that under international humanitarian law, civilians in Sudan, and as a matter of fact, anywhere around the world, must be protected and must never be subject of acts of sexual violence, which could constitute war crimes. Turning to Ukraine, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tells us that several civilians were injured while homes and railways and infrastructure sustained damage in attacks on the town of Smila in the Cherkasy region, which is in the center of Ukraine. Aid workers are on site providing emergency response, including support to repair windows in damaged homes. Meanwhile, our humanitarian colleagues warn that intensified hostilities have slowed down the delivery of aid to frontline towns in Chasiv Yar and in the Chasno Rivka area in the Donetsk region, where several thousand civilians continue to live amidst ongoing hostilities and disrupted access to critical services. And our colleagues in Paris at the UN Organization for Education, Science and Culture, otherwise known as UNESCO, launched a report today on how social media affects girls' well-being, learning, and career choices. The report warns that while digital technologies can enhance teaching and learning, they also present risks such as invasion of users' privacy, distraction from learning, and cyberbullying. It also sheds light on how social media amplifies gender stereotypes with negative effects on girls' well-being, learning, and career choices. More online and related to that. Today is the International Girls in ICT Day. In a post on his Twitter account, the Secretary General called to equip and support more girls in information and communications technology, pointing out that fewer women than men have access to the internet, and that stands in their way of getting equal opportunity for work. Today is also World Malaria Day. This year's theme is accelerating the fight against malaria for a more equitable world. 94% of all malaria cases and 95% of deaths are in the World Health Organization's Africa region, and that's data since 2022. There is another international day today, which you can all go celebrate in the Delegates Lounge. And you know what day that is? I was going to say something, but it would get me in trouble with a certain member state that you come from. No, today is International Delegates Day. Just a reminder that without delegates and their lounge, who negotiate agreements and coordinate with their home countries, the United Nations would not be what it is. I don't know. I'll stop before I lose my job. Edie.
Thank you, Steph. Is Sigrid Kaag leading the UN negotiations on the UN involvement in building the U.S. pier?
She's involved in it. A number of other entities are involved in it. I mean, as you know, different UN organizations have different mandates, but I think she was pretty clear on her involvement yesterday when she spoke to you and to the Council.
And a second question. Human Rights Watch is reporting that the armed forces in Burkina Faso have massacred over 200 civilians in a village raid. does the United Nations have any confirmation of this or any comment?
I do not have any confirmation from at this point here. I can tell you that these reports are extremely, extremely disturbing, and we will be looking into them. Mr. Lynch.
There it is. Hi, Steph. Can you give me a sense of whether the UN agencies have reached agreement with the Israelis and the Americans on whether they will distribute from the pier, where the pier is going to be? I gather it's in southern Gaza instead of the north. Will they operate out of a kind of Israeli IDF security perimeter?
All those discussions are ongoing. As we've said repeatedly, for us, there are a number of principles that we need to observe, of humanitarian principles, notably on our independence, on our freedom to deliver aid to those who need it without any interference. So all these things, I mean, both in terms of policy and logistics, are currently being discussed. Michelle, and then Vladimir.
Just a follow-up to that, how much of this is to do with the security arrangements that the US might have with the IDF on securing the pier, and then how the UN interacts with that?
Well, let's be honest. When you're operating a humanitarian operation in a combat zone, security is pretty high on the list. Vladimir, and then Kristen.
Thank you. I have two questions, if you don't mind. My question concerns yesterday's Russian veto of the draft resolution calling on all countries not to deploy nuclear arms in space. The US ambassador suggested that Russia was hiding something, and it was shameful. What is the Secretary General's position on this issue? I mean,
well, I mean, the vote is the vote, right? And Security Council votes. Those members that have the power of the veto sometimes use that veto. We stand, so I have no particular comment on what happened in the Council yesterday, but of course the United Nations stands against the nuclearization of outer space.
Another question. The European Parliament adopted a resolution on Russia's undemocratic presidential elections and their illegitimate extension to the occupied territories. The resolution urges the member state of the EU and the international community not to recognize the outcome of the Russian presidential elections and to limit relations with Putin to humanitarian and human rights purposes. Will the Secretary General take into account the position of democratic countries on the so-called Russian election?
I mean, the Secretary General has always, anywhere in the world, called for free and fair election. That being said, we remain in contact and have relations with all 193 member states of this organization. Madame.
Thank you, Step. The Palestinian Civil Defense had a press conference earlier on those mass graves at the hospitals in Gaza and said that they found many that looked like they were buried alive, medical tubes in them. The question is, what should they do with that information? They say they need forensic examination. Where should they go for this? What would the UN advise them to do?
I think it is important, all the excuse me, these circumstances, to ensure that any potential evidence is kept in a way that is not compromised. We've called for an international investigation. How that will take place, it's unclear at this time. There's certain parts of this organization that have the authority to do that.
Which parts of the organization do you think could be of help?
Well, I mean,
there's certainly
investigations can be those vary, right? There are legislative bodies of this organization that could create and call for an international investigation. That has yet to happen. In the meantime, it's important that all forensic evidence be well preserved.
What about the special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary
They're not,
arbitrary
they're not
executions, or-
investigatory, they don't have investigatory authority. Deji, and then we'll go to the screen, and we'll come back for round two.
Well, first, a hypothetical question. It's not a hypothetical question anyway. We know that there's this plan to start the ground offensive in Rafah city from IDF, but it's kept postponing, but they said they didn't call it off. How much improvement does the UN has to prepare for humanitarian response to that? Yeah, like because you got more time to prepare.
Well, let's first off, the last thing we would want to see is a military operation, a ground operation in Rafah, given for the more than 1.5 million people that are displaced there and have no place to go. One can easily imagine the humanitarian catastrophe that this would be. We're well aware of what is being talked about in the news. We make the contingency plans that we're able to make, but let's remember, as I told Michelle a few minutes ago, we're operating in a conflict zone, right? In which we have we don't have the full control of the aid that can come in to Gaza. What I can tell you is that we will not be a party to any forced displacement of people.
But as we know, the summer is coming. In that part, in Gaza Strip, the temperature would increase quite dramatically in the summer. How much worry does the Secretary General feel about the living conditions for those displaced
the
people
living
there?
conditions are already atrocious.
But
as we mentioned, the garbage is probably the whole system of treatment of solid waste has basically crumbled with the unimaginable sanitation impact that has on people's health. Michelle, then Ibtisam. So just go ahead.
Just on Haiti, can you share with us the list of which countries so far have notified of their involvement or plan to be involved in the security mission?
I can, not off the top of my head.
Okay,
I will
and
let
how
you know.
much?
I don't think the needle has moved on the cash in the account.
And how much cash is in the account?
It was 10.6, I think.
Okay.
Well, let me not think and let me check.
Okay, thank you.
Ibtisam, and then we'll go to Alan on screen.
I want to follow up on Kristen's question regarding the forensic evidence. You said that they should preserve any forensic evidence, etc. But we know, as a matter of fact, that people there are overwhelmed, whether doctors or any teams, etc. Shouldn't the UN be then proactive and send teams to help them do that? Given the situation on the ground.
It's not a matter of the Secretary General be proactive, because we do not have a mandate to participate in such an investigation at this time. The other thing is you well know, that for any investigation to actually be effective, investigators, wherever they come from, would need to have access in Gaza, which would require the permission of a number of countries, including Israel.
But if I may push back a little bit on that, because you don't have to start. Isn't it? If I'm not wrong, it's part of your mandate also, or at least parts of the UN, to collect informations and evidence on what's happening on the ground. It's like. You don't have to be also.
No, we are. Let's not get too much into the weeds here. We're collecting information, taking custody of potential evidence is a different issue. Let's go to Alan, and then we'll go to our guest.
Hello, Stefan. Do you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
a question, please. A court in Ukraine arrested the abbot of the Svyatogorsk Lavra of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. His name is Arseny, Metropolitan Arseny. So he's arrested, and I have a question. Given the well-known track record of the Ukrainian oppressions against Orthodox priests, does the ESG have any opinion on the freedom of religion in Ukraine?
We firmly believe in the freedom of a religion. Let me look into this case and see what I can get for you, Alan.
Okay, along with that, we heard from the United Nations today, and as they're talking about, of course, the U.S. and Japan trying to mitigate the threat of nuclear harm. And we also heard from the press floor questions and answers about what is happening in Haiti, Syria, with Palestine. The big question still remains, should Palestine be allowed full membership in the United Nations? There's a lot of debate one way or against that. Which also leads to the massive destruction that has happened in the past months in the Middle East, either by the hands of, Syria, Iran, Israel. The level of violence, it just seems to keep escalating, and with limited humanitarian efforts available to the people just like you and I, just want to go to work, just want to have a good, happy life, and they have no real political temperature, shall we say. They have no real say in what is happening in the government, and yet they're being held responsible and being treated as they are the ones that are making the decisions, because they're the ones that are being bombed. They're the ones that are being dismembered, finding themselves in hospitals because they've been blown up. Some of this needs to end, and we need to find a more loving way of living so that we all can just have happy, abundant lives. Thank you for listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs, and look for that subscribe button wherever it may be. Hey, if you come across a support link, please toss us some support, and so we can keep broadcasting and podcasting about issues that are hurting our human rights and those government policies that are being destructive to our world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.